At last, a voice for the people who pay big government bills, not the people who make big government bills. You are listening to Speaking of Taxpayers, sponsored by the 362,000-member National Taxpayers Union. I'm your co-host, Pete Sepp.
And I'm your co-host, Doug Kellogg.
Welcome to this week's broadcast.
Well, we're going to have a pretty interesting and packed show today. Pete's going all over the place. We're going to talk a little bit more about National Taxpayers Union Foundation's BillTall study, which we spoke a little bit about last week, getting a little bit more into some of the details there with NTUF's Dan Barrett. We'll have a couple more interns join us for a little fun. But first, let's start off with some of the goings-on in government. Pete is still on the internet sales tax tour. Ohio and Iowa were the stops this week, so very big, important electoral states. But the real news is on Capitol Hill, and we promise not to overdo the MFA stuff, but it is really important to note that MFA in the Senate is being attached to the Internet Tax Freedom Act, which is something we spoke about a couple of weeks ago on the podcast as a very important measure which went through the House. And now the Senate is back to its shenanigans with any good piece of legislation.
Yes, what a mess, but it couldn't be timelier in regard to our internet sales tax roadshow. When we were in Iowa, Des Moines specifically, we were pointing out that the poll results among Iowans, especially those who intended to participate in the 2016 presidential caucus, were very skeptical of the enforcement powers that would be given to states to pursue this scheme. And Ohioans, of course, were given the chance to have a mock election in the poll that we released there. They were asked to vote between one candidate who supported Marketplace Fairness Act, another who opposed it. The one who opposed it carried the day by a huge margin, not only among Republicans, but among Democrats and independents. Once again, by 2-to-1 margins overall, skepticism over giving states these extraterritorial tax collection powers, and huge margins of conservatives in both states. So Republicans who are on the wrong side of this issue, beware, your political future may be at stake. An especially timely message for candidates going out to Iowa. I believe actually Governor Christie of New Jersey was coming out the day after we released our poll there. But again, you say, and you're correct, the more important issue is what's going to happen in the next week, potentially, in the United States Senate, attaching the Marketplace Fairness Act, a truly terrible bill, to the Permanent Internet Tax Freedom Act, a truly great bill. And that sets the stage for a nightmare scenario, and a rather contradictory one, whereby you are trying to protect the internet from access taxes at one point, while throwing a new tax collection regime for e-commerce on the other hand. If the Senate passes that dual package, it'll go back to the House potentially with basically a vote for this or else message, or there might be a conference committee between the two chambers. Either way, this threat is becoming more palpable every day.
And I think that, with the growing public disdain for this bill, I think that the pressure on the pro-MFA side is just building. They want to take advantage of the fact that they got that through the Senate without people paying too much attention and force the House to do something. And now they're trying to hold a good piece of legislation like the Internet Tax Freedom Act, which is kind of a no-brainer, hostage with it. So unfortunate development, but it's something to keep an eye on. Let's go through a couple other things from the Hill this week. Highway Trust Fund sort of stopgap was passed. What do we take from this, Pete? It looks like a tax increase was avoided, or at least we got some sort of tax cut, but is this the right way to go about this policy?
Yeah, potentially a massive tax increase was avoided. Yeah. There were all kinds of attempts to inject more money into the so-called Highway Trust Fund by raising taxes elsewhere. There was talk in the Senate, for example, of repealing several tax provisions such as the Section 199 job creation deduction, but only for oil and gas companies. That would have been a very discriminatory measure. We avoided it, at least in this context. So what we're getting is an extension of current policy and the likelihood of debate sometime next year over a multi-year authorization bill. I suppose it could have been worse for taxpayers, but it could have been a lot better. We could have seen a more concerted effort to root out non-essential spending. After all, we see the Highway Trust Fund used for expenditures on things like mass transit. That's only tangentially related to highways. Proponents say, well, this helps to reduce some of the burden of traffic on roads by moving more people to rails. That's a dubious proposition in many places. The ridership numbers versus the amount of money spent on light and heavy rail don't always work out very well. It's not necessarily a great deal for taxpayers. And then there's totally frivolous spending on non-highway items. There's also not enough of a concerted effort to take a look at improving the contracting procedures themselves, incorporating things like life cycle cost analysis so that you're getting the best value for the money that's being spent on things like pavement. Didn't really touch many of those questions. They just went for something that was rather middle of the road, so to speak.
Let's move on to the Congressional Budget Office report, which came out this week. Long-term analysis of the budget situation. It is a long report. There's a lot to take from it. And unfortunately, what they found wouldn't really surprise anybody. And that means the same things that we've been yelling about for a long time in terms of the budget situation getting worse, the deficit never completely closing, and heading towards an unsustainable fiscal future is just still that's the case, and that looks like what we're expecting in this CBO, a 25-year long-term outlook report. So what in particular did you take from it, Pete?
Well, it's interesting to note, of course, that the CBO's long-term outlook is now taking into account things like the increase in the top income tax rate, the fact that there are large surtaxes associated with Obamacare, other types of taxes on things like tanning that have taken effect. All these heavier tax burdens are now being cooked into CBO's projections, and guess what? The debt is still going to increase by huge margins. Federal spending as a percentage of our gross domestic product will increase dramatically, or comparatively so.
To as much as 26% of GDP by 2039, which I don't know, is that a record, or is that in line with some of the highs we've seen before around World War II?
If you take the years after World War II, it's quite high. Very high. And of course, the total amount of public debt, now we're not talking about gross federal debt here, that includes the debt owed to the so-called trust funds for Social Security and Medicare. I say so-called because there's no trust and no fund there, folks. But even taking a look at just the debt owed to the public under the CBO's what's called alternative fiscal scenario, the one that has generally shown to have been the most likely outcomes, in other words, incorporating Congress's normal decisions not to decide on things. Looking at that alternative fiscal scenario, public debt as a percentage of our economic output is expected to be 180% by the year 2039. That is worse than a Greek-style fiscal blowout.
Yeah, and the post-World War II average is at 20.4% or something of GDP in terms of spending. So when you're looking at deficits that will never close and thus growing debt and taxes that have already been risen, although the CBO report also projects that taxes will have to go even higher, it just doesn't seem like a good scenario. And it's hopefully one that people will turn back from. Hopefully we will see some fiscal restraint, even if it's not a full balanced budget amendment, which would be the right thing to do, some significant spending cuts other than, we'll talk about BillTall in a couple of minutes. It's a good way to illustrate just how Congress continues to propose agendas. There's certainly folks who want to cut spending, but overall, they're proposing agendas that would increase the budget further.
Yeah, and part of the problem is there's just not enough willingness to look at the biggest drivers of debt, which remain entitlement programs. You have the Disability Trust Fund, and I'm doing air quotes around trust fund again. That is about to go broke in a period of just several years. We're not talking about decades from now. We're talking about just single years now that we're counting down to doomsday there. And then after that, you've got Medicare's Hospital Insurance Trust Fund, and then the big kahuna, Social Security's Trust Fund, starts to go belly up. This is happening somewhat gradually, but a 25-year time period is not something where you can say, oh, that's so far off we can't even conceive of it. In fact, the problems are now coming home to roost. By 10 years from now, we're going to be in very serious shape. And if we don't act, if we don't make changes structurally, fundamentally in some of these entitlement programs, we will find ourselves as a third world nation financially in short order, comparatively.
And I think one last thing just to note is that, we're talking about a 25-year outlook. That seems like a long time, but even the 25-year long-term outlook isn't that long, especially when we think about what Congress has done. We've talked about it on the podcast, but when getting rid of the caps, the sequester spending caps, and then trying to find the savings over 10 years out, that's not that long a time when we look at these long-term budgeting things. So it's unfortunate that that's the case, and if Congress doesn't get their act in line soon, that those 25 years will sneak up quite quickly. And all those gimmicks, whether it's the spending caps or other budget gimmicks that try to find savings over 10-year periods and further into the future, will just hit that wall as we get closer and closer to sort of more economic catastrophe.
Yes, I mean, yours truly, here on Speaking of Taxpayers, began his work with National Taxpayers Union 26 years ago. So when you look at it that way, when we were back in 1988 complaining over high federal deficits at that point and worried about the future of Social Security and Medicare, boy, what I would have given for those 25 years or 26 years to have had some more honest reform efforts, we would not be facing this situation now. And now, Bill Tally, you ain't seen nothing yet. Folks, you may have heard in the last edition of Speaking of Taxpayers, the 30,000-foot view of the latest NTU Foundation Bill Tally report. That's the one that takes a look at every piece of major spending legislation introduced in Congress, not just voted on, and does all kinds of fantastic research regarding that legislation and how it is sponsored and co-sponsored by lawmakers. Here we have Dan Barrett, NTUF's Research and Outreach Manager, with an exciting new way of looking at Bill Tally data.
Gentlemen, how's it going? Now, we have this big Bill Tally database with 21 years worth of savings and cost bills and everything like that. But the real question is, how do we break all that data down? And so National Taxpayers Union Foundation has put together a Bill Tally resource page that breaks down lots of different data points. We're talking we can divide it by the full Congress, by chamber, by party, by agenda. There's a whole bunch of different ways. If you want to look at your entire state delegation, we have spreadsheets that are for that, but we also have a dedicated state page for each state and for the territories. So there's a lot going on, and the real question is, what does all this data tell us? And so going back over the data points from last week that Damien went over with you guys is that on net, if every non-overlapping bill introduced in Congress was passed, we'd see about a $1.1 trillion spending increase for each of the next 5 years. Now, breaking this down by chamber and by party, we can see that House Republicans, they introduced on average a net agenda of $83 billion in net reduction. Now, compared to the previous Congress in total, that would be $48 billion less, as in it is closer to zero, so they sponsored fewer savings bills overall. Now, House Democrats sponsored a $397 billion spending increase. Now, a lot of taxpayers out there are going to be shocked by that number, but guess what? It's $100 billion less in new spending that was proposed compared to the previous Congress. Switching over to the Senate Republicans sponsored a $159 billion net cut agenda, and that's $80 billion closer to zero compared to the previous Congress. And then Senate Democrats were about an $18 billion spending increase, which is $5 billion less than the 112th Congress.
So they both seem to be converging a little bit toward the center if you define the center in the hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yes, it sort of depends on how you want to look at it. Yeah, like if you're thinking that the less the Congress does, the worse damage it can do in terms of growing the debt, we are slightly better than we were in the previous Congress. Now, at the same time, when it comes to net reduction, it's getting a little worse comparatively.
I see. Now, among various caucuses of lawmakers, and this is something we didn't really touch on in the last segment of Speaking of Taxpayers on BillTall, there are some fascinating results because caucuses are gatherings of like-minded lawmakers, and presumably you'd see a bit more ideological coherence, and that might be reflected in their fiscal agendas.
That's true. So what BillTall does is we look at 6 different fiscally related caucuses. Now, on the Republican side, there are 3 that blatantly say that they are looking for fiscal sustainability or to cut the deficit. There's a whole number of terms that they use. Now, on the other side, there's 3 caucuses that are fiscally related, talking about economic justice and other things like that. So we try to compare them to show how smaller factions within Congress look and propose the spending. So starting off with the Tea Party caucus, they actually, on average, propose the largest net cut agenda, and that's $127 billion. Now, going back to what we just discussed, this is actually significantly smaller compared to the previous Congress. They proposed $234 billion in annual net decreases last Congress. So, yeah, we're talking about a significant drop in the number of savings bills and the total number of savings dollars that they were proposing. The Republican Study Committee also had a smaller agenda this time. They had $99 billion in average cuts compared to the $209 billion from the 112th Congress. Then rounding out in the more moderate faction is the Republican Main Street Partnership, which would cut $32 billion from the federal budget compared to the $76 billion from the last Congress.
Wow, fascinating. And you know, one of the interesting things on your resource page is an interactive map, and there you can find all sorts of data on state delegations, and that's of interest to a lot of folks because they want to know, well, what overall contribution is my state making to the fiscal policy agenda?
Yes, so there's a House, a full Congress, and a Senate breakdown page of many, many different kinds of ways to look at delegations. So this week we'll look at the House average delegation numbers. That's taking everybody in your state and averaging them out, whether they're in the House or the Senate. We're combining them all to see what their average agenda is. And so sort of at the top of the largest cut agendas would be Utah with $132.7 billion in net annual decreases. That's followed by Wyoming at 122 and Kansas at 119. South Carolina, one of the larger delegations, at least at the near the top of the list, would do $105 billion in net reductions per year.
Yeah, so only a handful of states, I'm just counting 5 total, who would make a net collective contribution on average of $100 billion or more in spending cuts.
Yes, and you know, if you want to look at the other side of larger spending increase agendas, I mean, we're looking at, though they're smaller as well, there's Vermont that has a $1.2 trillion average net agenda, and that's with their 1 representative and their 2 senators. Maine also has a pretty high spending increase agenda at $663 billion for each year. So we're talking about real dollars here.
Yikes. And I see that the state of California, which of course has the biggest congressional delegation of anyone, even averaged $341.7 billion of additional spending a year. That's several dozen lawmakers on average working very hard to boost federal spending by a significant amount.
Yes, and most of the time we're looking, if you have a delegation that's sponsoring in the hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars, we're looking at the sponsorship and support of single-payer health care, which would increase the federal budget by at least $1 trillion a year.
So we've gone from Congress as a whole, down to the chambers, down to the state delegations. Now we're down to individual performance levels.
Yes, so we also track member agendas that average out to reduce the federal budget. And so we looked at the last 3 Congresses, and we found that on net, they're increasing in the individuals who are doing this. We have 84 House members and 22 senators over the last 3 Congresses who have proposed, in addition to what our baseline was in the 111th Congress, to reduce federal spending. Now, on the other side, we have a decrease in the number of spending agendas that would increase federal spending by $100 billion. Over the last 3 Congresses in the House, 60 representatives have left that group, so they would either increase spending slightly, or some of them have actually gone into the savings territory. On the other chamber, there's 23 fewer senators who are sponsoring $100 billion annual increase agendas compared to 5 years ago.
I see. And more senators sponsoring agendas to reduce federal spending. So at least in that respect, you seem to have fewer lawmakers willing to go out on a limb and say, let's really boost the budget highly, and more who are saying, let's pull back a little on the outlays.
Yeah, now let's not pat Congress on the back too much, because over the last Congress, they've actually decreased in some of those numbers. There's slightly fewer net savings agendas in both the House and the Senate this time around compared to the 111th and the 112th Congresses.
I see, but one interesting statistic I spied here was there's just one senator now with a net spending agenda greater than $100 billion. Used to be 24 just 2 Congresses ago.
Yes, and that one senator, you'll have to actually search for through our member database to find out exactly which senator would sponsor over $100 billion in increases. And you just have to go to www.ntu.org/NTUF, and you can go ahead and search for your member of Congress or the senators that represent you in your state. Now, the one big pitch that we have here is that we rely on member contributions to help us score more bills and hold more officials accountable for the spending that they're proposing. So we need as many people helping us out as possible. So go ahead and check out our NTUF homepage off of ntu.org, and we really appreciate the support that we've gotten so far.
Absolutely. Please keep it coming, folks, and please keep that research coming too, Dan. Thanks for joining us.
Now, once again, we're joined by a couple National Taxpayers Union Foundation interns, Ji-Hoon Han and Alex Eblin, spending the summer working with the foundation. Alex, in particular, helped bring you some of the state data, which we just discussed with NTUF's Dan Barrett, and last week with NTUF Director of Research Damian Brady. So welcome to the podcast, Alex.
Thank you.
And you're working on an interesting blog, which actually caught my attention as a D.C. resident, finding out that the district no longer requires you to have a license to give tours.
That's right. Up until the 27th of June, the district required anyone giving a tour through the D.C. area to pay $200 for a license and pass an examination in order to give those tours. An illegal Segway tour guide within the district sued to have that licensure system overturned, and was successful in doing so. And so now one of many job-destroying regulations in the district and throughout the country is now ceased to exist.
Really interesting. And what got you interested in working with NTUF and working in the liberty and conservative movement in the first place?
Well, like regulation, taxes and overtaxation has some of the same constraining effects, and so NTUF does a great job of making those effects known through their educational programs and allowing people to know what actually goes on in Washington and what that does to the rest of the country.
Excellent. So Jihoon is our other intern this week. Jihoon in particular interested in some of the some sports world oriented stuff, and it's a topic that we don't talk about too much here, but I know some of our really dedicated listeners might remember that last summer we wrote a little bit about free agents saving some money by leaving the U.S. tax environment in hockey. But Jihoon, what in particular about freedom in the sports world is sort of, or in particular about the sports world, drew your attention to free markets and liberty?
Well, first off, I want to say I'm glad to be here on America's #1 podcast for taxpayers here in Alexandria, Virginia.
I don't think we cannot endorse that claim.
Anyways, what drew me interested in the sports is I come from a mixed martial arts background. You know, I grew up training in mixed martial arts, became an amateur cage fighter, and politics is huge in MMA. 49 states legalized mixed martial arts. New York is the only state in the union to not legalize mixed martial arts. Takes away a lot of the freedoms that you mentioned from these MMA fighters in New York. I go to college in New York at Syracuse University, and I've been training at some of the gyms, and you know it's tough for a lot of those professional fighters. They have to go outside of the state to go and compete, which is a huge hassle for them, their team. It costs a lot of money, and you know it's just heartbreaking for a lot of those guys that just can't compete in their own state in their own backyards.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's not something we focus on a lot, but with all these things, they're sort of a big fish target. But you know, you're really bringing light to the normal guys, the little guys who aren't really the face of a business, but are really adversely affected by that type of regulation because they really can't afford to just train or fight or do something in another state. It's actually significant cost to them. It's really interesting stuff.
Like you said, it's just tough for these guys. And, you know, it's really just, it's all politics. It's not because the state assembly, the New York Legislative Assembly believes that mixed martial arts is a dangerous sport. It's because of these culinary unions that have some sort of beef with the UFC officials. And so they've been lobbying, pushing really hard to Sheldon Silver, the assembly speaker there, to really push forward to keep it illegal in New York.
Very familiar to, speaking of taxpayers listeners, to hear about a political game like that. So glad to have you both this summer. Really appreciate you stopping in and getting grilled on the podcast. And best of luck going forward. It's time for the outrage of the week. And Russia is in the news, unfortunately, in regards to a tragedy. This isn't directly related to that, but this is related to the Russia and Ukraine crisis, and certainly directly related to Russia. The Daily Signal and Diane Katz of Heritage Foundation have a really interesting article up about how the Ex-Im Bank, which has been a lot of fun to discuss over recent months, is involved with two of the firms that are being sanctioned by the U.S. government as part of the ongoing response to the crisis in Ukraine. And this is extremely interesting. This is a lot of money. So these two firms have gotten loans, multi-year, multi-million-dollar loans from Ex-Im Bank. One is a 12-year loan guarantee of $497 million. The other is a $22.6 million over 5-year loan guarantee. That's a lot of money going to these firms, and one of which is Gazprom Bank, which, as Pete astutely pointed out before we went on the air for the outrage, is related to Gazprom, which is a state-related company. So
yeah, there's a lot
really questionable like how they would even be able to get money from Ex-Im. So a really interesting connection in light of Russia being back in the news with recent events with their conflict in Ukraine.
Yeah, oligarchs with ties to the government, and so this is very bizarre, but it's typical of the corporate welfare arrangements we see in so many of these government programs. People who don't need the money are getting the money. And again, this is a cost to taxpayers. The Congressional Budget Office recently did a different treatment of the valuation and operation of Ex-Im Bank's loan and loan guarantee portfolios and found that no, it does not make a profit for the U.S. Treasury. Over time, there is a genuine cost to taxpayers for Ex-Im's operations. The bank's charter is coming up for renewal very soon, and for once, Congress need do nothing to make sure that the bank's charter goes out of existence. The do-nothing Congress finally has the chance to do something good for taxpayers here. And this whole sanction business of firms that are recipients of Ex-Im's largesse or favors is why this is the outrage of the week. That about does it for this edition of Speaking of Taxpayers. Remember, folks, you have the power to fight the power if you speak truth to power. And we speak truth to power every week here on Speaking of Taxpayers.
And if you want to learn more about anything we've discussed today, check us out at ntu.org. Follow us on Twitter at NTU. And if you would like to email the show with any questions, we're happy to answer them. The email is studios, studios, @ntu.org.